In the quiet mountain town of Woodland Park, Colorado, a family's search for their missing son dragged on for years without any answers. Joshua Maddox was just 18 years old when he left his house on a spring morning back in 2008. He told his sister he was going out for a walk, but after that, he vanished. No phone calls, no sightings, not a trace left behind. A few days later, he was reported missing to the police, but their efforts didn't lead anywhere, and for 7 long, grueling years, the Maddox family was stuck in a nightmare. Then, in 2015, a horrible discovery in a cabin only a mile from the family home suddenly shattered that silence. See, a crew of contractors was tearing down an abandoned cabin when, out of nowhere, they stumbled onto something inside the chimney. It was the mummified remains of a human body, twisted up and wedged deep into the brickwork. Those remains were later identified as Joshua's, and even though he'd finally been found, it was in one of the strangest and most haunting ways you could imagine. But the discovery left a bunch of questions about his death still hanging. Like, what exactly happened to Joshua Maddox the day he walked out? What clues did he leave behind? Was this just a tragic accident? Or was someone else involved for darker reasons? Welcome to Colorado Springs, everyone. Tucked right at the base of the Rocky Mountains, it's a place known for its incredible peaks, endless hiking trails, and a community that lives right on nature's doorstep. Tourists flock here for the Garden of the Gods, military families come for the nearby Air Force Academy, and dreamers show up for that crisp mountain air that feels like it promises a better life. It's gotta be good, right? I mean, it looks pretty tempting, honestly. I even thought about moving there myself a few years back. But underneath that pretty picture, Colorado Springs has always had a darker side. With how fast it's grown, the city's dealt with crime rates that are higher than the national average, especially when it comes to violent crime. Methamphetamine has left some deep scars on local communities, often hitting folks who are already struggling with mental health issues. Gang activity and drug trafficking have woven themselves deep into the city, and even the geography plays a creepy part here. The thick forests and huge wilderness areas around Colorado Springs have hidden more than a few bodies over the years. Investigators will tell you it's a pretty convenient place to disappear, whether that's by choice or by force. And that's not all, because some of the country's most unsettling crimes have happened right here. We're talking serial killers to unsolved mysteries that still bother detectives today. Speaking of which, today we're heading about 25 miles northwest of Colorado Springs to a little town called Woodland Park. Founded back in 1887, it's home to around 8,000 people. And since it's buried deep in the forests and mountains, it's beautiful in its own way, but mysterious too. And it's here that you'd find Joshua Maddox and his family. Born on March 9, 1990 in Woodland Park, Joshua grew up with his dad and 3 siblings, Kate, Ruth, and Zachary. He was the baby of the family, so his brother and sisters often looked out for him. Sadly, his mom and dad had split up a while before, so he was in a broken home. After being homeschooled for his first couple years, Joshua moved into the Woodland Park school system, where he quickly stood out as a really sharp student. Teachers remembered him as smart, bright, and gifted. He was also a great guitarist for his age. And yeah, with a quick sense of humor and a spark for adventure, he was also known to be a bit of a troublemaker sometimes, thanks to his curious streak. On top of that, friends described Joshua as witty, easygoing, and caring. The key thing here? He was someone who loved to go out on an adventure. Now, Joshua loved the Colorado wilderness, and honestly, he wasn't scared to spend a night or two under the stars, which meant he'd sometimes disappear for a couple days. This habit of being hard to track was something his parents never really got used to. But then again, in a place like Woodland Park, what could really go wrong? It also seemed like Joshua carried a certain toughness in him, shaped by tragedy. Because sadly, just 2 years earlier in 2006, his older brother Zachary had taken his own life. This obviously devastated the family, but it hit Joshua harder than anyone. Depression took hold of him after that, and even though he eventually found his way out of that darkness, it was a long and tough road. And then, as you know, only 2 years later, he'd suddenly vanish. trudged through lakes and ponds, and scoured the mountains around Woodland Park. Search dogs were brought in, posters went up, and neighbors kept their eyes open. But despite everyone's best efforts, every trail went cold and every lead went nowhere. It was like Joshua had stepped into the wilderness and just vanished. In the middle of all the grief and worry, Joshua's sister put up a post on Facebook that said, "Since Joshua was 18, it's reasonable to think he might have decided to leave town to start a new life." As one of his two older sisters, I've always chosen to believe that was the case. I expected Josh to come home to my dad's house anytime with a wife and little kids. Josh was always known for his music and writing talent. So maybe one day we'd find him playing in a band on tour, or catch him writing successful novels under a pen name so he could keep his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods. These words from his sister give you a good sense of what his family was thinking when Joshua disappeared. And it's true, he was an adult now. So not only could he make his own choices, but he could come and go as he pleased. Besides that, it sounds like he'd actually thought about leaving and staying anonymous. So, with him gone now, that doesn't automatically mean he's in danger, right? And if you look at the facts, there really wasn't anything to suggest he was. Joshua was a good kid. He had good grades, people liked him, and he had a good head on his shoulders. So maybe he was just staying out of trouble. Friends also said that in the months leading up to his disappearance, Joshua wasn't just okay, he was actually happy. So with that, the police had no reason to suspect foul play. The searches kept up for a while, but with no leads, all hope slowly started to fade. And as weeks turned into months and months into years, all efforts eventually stopped. But something didn't feel right to his family, especially to his dad. In fact, he was so worried that even after he moved, he kept the family home just in case Joshua came back. He figured that would be the one place Joshua would know to go if he wanted to find them. But that moment would never come because Joshua was gone. Fast forward 7 years, and on Friday, August 12th, 2015, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Woodland Park police were called to a property on Meadowwork Lane. Now it turns out Meadowwork Lane wasn't far at all from Joshua's old family home. In fact, it was just a mile down the road. The property belonged to a 79-year-old man named Chuck Murphy, who at the time was the president of Murphy Constructors. The cabin had been in his family for decades. His parents originally bought it on what was once part of the notorious Thunderhead Ranch, a place known for illegal gambling, bootlegging, and wild parties. Now, Chuck's brother had lived in the cabin for more than 30 years before it eventually became a rental. And once that was over, the place sat empty from 2004 all the way to 2015, falling apart the whole time. Every once in a while, Chuck would check on the property to make sure everything was okay. And even though he didn't note any major damage, the place got broken into multiple times. By 2015, the cabin was finally done. The land was being cleared for a new development that would put up 32 family homes in the area. And since this cabin was in the way, well, it was set to be demolished for a decent price. But this is where things fell apart and the mystery of Joshua Maddox got deeper because during the demolition, something horrible was found. As the demolition crew tore the cabin apart, one worker looked into the half-wrecked chimney, and that's when he froze. Because wedged just above the lounge's fireplace, about 3 feet off the ground and curled up in a fetal position, were the mummified human remains of a man. It was noted the body was stiff, dark, and twisted in a really disturbing way, with the knees pulled tight above the head and one hand raised toward the face. The legs, which were stripped of flesh by then, had come loose from the torso. And maybe the most unsettling detail of all is that the victim was almost naked, wearing nothing but a thermal shirt. The cabin had been silent for over 10 years. But now, well, it seemed to be holding a secret that was just too grim to ignore. When asked what the cabin was like before demolition, Chuck said the place was damp and it smelled awful. There was raccoon poop everywhere, and we really had no reason to go in there except to tear the building down. At first, officers had no idea who the body belonged to. I'm sure a few of them had a hunch, but none could be sure. So their first step was to check local databases and compare the body against all missing people in the area. And of course, that list included Joshua Maddox. They got their answer pretty quick after that because after checking dental records, they saw Joshua's was a match. And if that wasn't enough, they confirmed it a second time when they realized both the body and Joshua were missing the same joint from their index finger. Which means after 7 long years, Joshua had finally been found. And in some cruel twist, it wasn't even a mile away from his family's home. Honestly, that's a thought just as tragic as it is haunting. For several years, friends and family had searched the area hoping for a clue. Meanwhile, Josh's body lay hidden right behind a chimney wall. In fact, if you look at Google Street View images from that time, it's eerie to know his remains were right there, but just out of sight. And obviously, this is why the case of Joshua Maddox would eventually become known as the story of the boy in the chimney. So even though this discovery brought closure to the question of where he was, it didn't explain how he got there, why he was in that position, or what exactly happened in that cabin. And as it turns out, the deeper you look into this story, the weirder it gets. So let's take a closer look. So let's start with Joshua's autopsy. When the toxicology reports came back, they showed no trace of drugs or alcohol in his system. His body also showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no stab wounds, no bullets. So on paper, there was nothing to suggest foul play. With that in mind, the coroner, Albert, officially ruled Joshua's death as accidental, suggesting he'd most likely gotten trapped after falling down the chimney and then died from hypothermia. He also said Joshua's death wasn't immediate. Instead, he likely suffered a slow, agonizing end, either from hypothermia caused by the mountain's freezing air around him, or maybe from dehydration as the days ticked by in silence. So, from the coroner's point of view, a sad but resolved case, right? Well, the story does seem straightforward enough. Joshua went exploring that day, climbed onto the roof of a cabin barely a mile from his home, tried to slip in through the chimney, fell, got stuck, and then slowly died. If you look at it that way, then yes, tragic, but simple. However, it's when you look at the other details that things start making a lot less sense. The truth seems far stranger and darker. And the deeper you look into Joshua's death, the more unsettling the questions become. So let's first turn our attention to the cabin itself. Even from the very beginning, its owner, Chuck Murphy, had serious doubts about the coroner's theory. For starters, years before Joshua disappeared, Chuck had installed steel rebar across the top of the chimney to keep raccoons and other animals from getting inside. He also insisted to officers there was no way the guy crawled into that chimney with all that steel webbing up there. Simply put, he didn't come down that chimney. It's also worth saying this wasn't just speculation, because as a veteran of the construction industry, he knew his materials and their strength really well, and he was confident the rebar was still in place when the cabin came down. The only reason investigators found no trace of that rebar in the rubble was because apparently, Chuck had already ordered scrap collectors to salvage the metal the day before. This information blew huge holes in Alborn's theory, because if Chuck was right, then Joshua didn't actually enter from the roof. He must have gotten into that chimney from inside the cabin. If that wasn't enough, the scene inside the cabin only raised more questions too. See, Joshua was found wearing only a thermal shirt. And if you're wondering where the rest of his clothes were, well, they were inside the cabin. It is worth pointing out that reports differ on whether the clothes were neatly folded or just scattered on the floor. But either way, it strongly suggests he'd been in the cabin before ending up in that chimney. And this is where things get even more puzzling. Before the demolition even started, Chuck noticed something pretty strange inside the cabin. The breakfast bar had been ripped from the kitchen wall and dragged in front of the fireplace, almost like someone was trying to block or hide the chimney completely. And the bar itself wasn't some small piece of furniture either. In an interview, Chuck even said it was 10 feet wide and 4 feet tall, which is probably way too heavy for Joshua to have moved easily on his own. Understandably, this raises some pretty unsettling questions. Like, did Joshua somehow manage to shift the breakfast bar by himself? Or was it deliberately put there by someone trying to hide him? Another possible theory is maybe it was just moved by a squatter who was rearranging things in the cabin while trying to keep warm. In that case, it'd be really creepy to know a body was just a few feet away behind a wall. And the truth is, if Joshua had entered the chimney from inside the cabin, then these are basically the only three options. Either he moved the bar himself, someone moved the bar to try to hide him, or someone moved the bar without any idea he was inside. As an important side note, it's also possible he took off his own clothes while experiencing hypothermia. Usually in the late stages of hypothermia, there's this dark irony where people feel abnormally hot and then try to strip off their clothes, which basically seals their fate. But the thing is, if you check the historic temperatures for the night he disappeared, the weather stayed above 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius. And since hypothermia only starts at about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius, it's pretty hard to believe Joshua would have gone through that. And as it turns out, the deeper you look into this story, well, let's just say the stranger it gets. Only 3 days after ruling Joshua's death an accident, the coroner quietly reopened the case. But once again, after all the evaluations were done, the conclusion was the same: an accident and nothing more. However, while all this was going on, the police were actually getting dozens of phone calls. These included tips and even potential names, including someone who had supposedly bragged about murdering Joshua. And the person I want to focus on here is a guy named Andy Newman. Now, Andy was only a few years older than Joshua and also a familiar face from Woodland Park High School. But unlike Joshua, let's just say Andy's reputation wasn't so great. People who knew him described him as volatile, erratic, and sometimes even violent. And not only did he disappear around the same time as Joshua, but he'd go on to have quite the criminal record. A couple years after leaving Colorado, Andy eventually showed up again in New Mexico. Then in 2012, police found out he'd murdered a friend of his with a knife before running from the state. He was later caught, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison. Apparently, he was even accused of killing another person just a year before that too. So this alone was enough to spark new theories that maybe Andy was responsible for Joshua's death. I mean, he had a motive, the means, and a history with the area. And if that wasn't enough, it is also reported that Josh and Andy had supposedly been hanging out together in the months before they both disappeared. So it is no surprise that lots of people think maybe Andy was the one who forced him into that chimney. It's also worth pointing out here that his other offenses include grand theft, battery, drunkenness, and attacking a police officer. Now, officially, there's no evidence linking Andy to Joshua's death. Not only do records put him somewhere else at the time Joshua disappeared, but the police never named him as a suspect either. And at the same time, the coroner still believes Joshua's death was an accident. At the time I made my first video, and even now Andy's still behind bars. And if his record is anything to go by, that's exactly where he should be. In fact, as recently as March 2019, he made headlines again when he assaulted a detention officer. It's safe to say compassion has never been Andy's strong suit. So just like in my first video, what's my theory on the case of Joshua Maddox? Well, before we get to that, I want to toss out another possible theory I didn't actually consider when I first covered this case, and that's mental health and relapse. From everything that's been publicly reported, there's no sign Joshua had any diagnosed mental health issues. In fact, most reports keep stressing he was doing really well. Not only did he have a good group of friends around him, but he wasn't in any kind of trouble either. However, in these mystery cases, it's really important we cover every single angle. And there are two potential indicators that he might have been under some kind of relapse when he died. For example, Joshua was found almost completely naked. And while that could suggest murder with some kind of sexual foul play, it could also suggest something else. During certain kinds of mental health crises, people do sometimes take off their clothes for reasons like psychosis, severe mania, confusion, or neurological or drug-related issues. So, could Joshua have been going through something? Technically, it's possible. So what do I really think happened to Joshua Maddox? Well, after weighing all the evidence I have, and even sitting on it for 4.5 years, I still lean heavily toward murder. I mean, yes, there is a slim chance. Joshua had an accident or some kind of mental relapse that led him into that chimney. But when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the more believable explanation is that he crossed paths with the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong place. I mean, look, let's be blunt, I just can't see why Joshua would decide to be half naked inside a chimney in an abandoned cabin only a mile from his family, as home either on purpose or just for fun. So, with that said, I think either someone or something must have put him there, whether he was lured inside, forced against his will, or placed there after he died. The autopsy and toxicology reports showed no knife wounds, no bullets, and no broken bones. But the condition of his body after 7 years left a ton of possibilities open, most notably strangulation. And to be clear here, this doesn't automatically mean Andrew Newman is to blame. I mean, sure, he might be a possible suspect, but he's just one person among several theories. Sadly, with the cabin being torn down soon after Joshua was found and his body being cremated, it's very unlikely we'll ever find out what really happened to him. If Joshua really was murdered, then I guess the only real closure we'll ever get is if his killer comes forward someday, but the chances are pretty small. And I guess with that said, those are my thoughts on the case of Joshua Maddox for the second time. So, for those of you who saw the first version of this video, you'll notice I've actually added some extra details here. But the one thing I want to talk about before wrapping up is how this case shaped this channel. The story of Joshua Maddox and the mystery behind his disappearance is what really sparked my interest to start this whole thing. And let me tell you, I had no idea how much it would grow. Throughout that time, a lot has changed, including my process, my team, and even the way I think about these cases, believe it or not. But when I first started researching this story, I remember having these recurring nightmares of Joshua being stuck in the wall behind my bed, clawing toward my face. It was genuinely a very disturbing experience, and honestly, it almost made me stop the channel completely. But I guess over time the process of getting used to it eventually kicks in, and now I'm much more grounded with these stories. On that note, folks, thank you so much for being here today. I really do appreciate it. And as always, I'll see you again pretty soon for another video. Until that moment comes, though, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you and goodbye.